Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session on the lessons from the underground, which promises to be a fascinating conversation. My name is Artie Mangan. I'm the director of the Restorative Food Systems program at Bioneers. In this world of strife, environmental degradation, and greed, there's a model civilization that is cooperative, highly productive, waste-free, diverse, very sophisticated, and whose activities are constantly creating conditions that support life on a wide scale. Even though that subterranean civilization, known as the soil microbiome, is invisible to the naked eye, it has a profound existential impact on life above ground. Our three guests have explored this fascinating underground world, its impacts on two very important ecosystems, forests and farms. David Montgomery is a MacArthur Fellow, an award-winning author, and professor of geomorphology at the University of Washington. And Biklé is a biologist, master gardener, and author. She is an expert on microbial life of soil and its importance to human well-being. And Suzanne Simard is a professor of Forest Ecology, University of British Columbia, and author of Finding Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest. Suzanne grew up in the cedar and hemlock inland rainforest of British Columbia. She comes from a family of horse loggers, a dangerous occupation in which many of her family members were seriously injured. For a while, she also worked in the logging industry, until her distress at the rapacious clear-cutting set her on a different course. But that association with the forest was Suzanne's entree into a world that aroused her fascination and curiosity of soil, plants, trees, and forest ecosystems. Her intrigue of the forest ultimately led to a breakthrough scientific discovery dubbed the Wood Wide Web by Nature magazine. She had to fight through male-dominated culture in her field to have that discovery taken seriously. But now her brilliant work is widely accepted and has profoundly changed the way we understand forest communities. Welcome, Suzanne.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Suzanne, as a doctoral student, you discovered something about the forest that radically upset the status quo. The discovery challenged the idea of species competing for resources at the expense of each other as the predominant impetus of nature. What did you find, and how was that discovery received by the scientific community?
Yeah, I started trying to look at the below ground world when I realized that what we were doing in forests, which was really trying to turn our old growth forests into plantations on the assumption that, we needed to be gardeners of the forest, that we needed to, manage the plants that we considered weeds, which were actually native plants, so that they wouldn't compete with these conifers. And I saw that this was a kind of a destructive practice, that, by reducing the biodiversity of these forests, in management of these forests, that we were actually inviting all kinds of distress. These trees were getting infected by pathogens and insect infestations. They seemed to grow well at first, but soon we realized, or I could see that they were not going to become, healthy trees in the future, and that these forests look so much different than the native forest, the old growth forest that they were replacing. And so this led me to look below ground and figure out what were we disconnecting. This connected place that I grew up in, these old growth forests, were looking so different and so sad in comparison. And so I had learned, I wasn't the first person to discover that these fungi in the soil, they're called mycorrhizal fungi. They're kind of helper fungi that take photosynthate from trees and use it to grow their mycelium, run through the soil, as Paul Stamets calls it, and gather nutrients and water and bring it back to the trees in exchange for photosynthate. That this symbiosis was ubiquitous in our forests, that all of our trees depended on it for their lives. And certain researchers, namely, the first one to really publish on this was David Reed in the United Kingdom, and then other people also were looking at the potential for trees to be connected in below ground, but it wasn't really common knowledge. And I was wondering whether or not this was the underlying problem with our forest, that we were disconnecting these mycorrhizas that could actually link trees and plants together. And so I went out to try to figure this out, and spent actually decades of my career, and still doing it, trying to understand, these connections in the soil. And it really is a wood wide web. It really is an internet below ground, with like just a density of connections that is, it's so dense. It's like below ground. It's like there are thousands of kilometers, even under a square meter of soil, that of fungi linking all these plants together, and that they're avenues for communication from plant to plant, tree to tree. And yeah, so I did this work showing that actually the plants that were perceived as weeds, and I was working with paper birch and aspen and these deciduous trees that were the target of Monsanto and these chemical companies trying to get rid of them, and realizing with the idea that they're competitors, and figuring out in my PhD that actually birch and Douglas fir were linked together by these webs below ground, and actually sharing carbon and water, and eventually looking at nitrogen back and forth between them, even very, very quickly. Like there's this rapid communication going on. It took us years to figure out how quick it is, but really, these resources, carbon, water, and so on, are moving, within minutes, hours, over days, years, and that it's this back and forth exchange going on. And also that, the more shade that these weeds were casting on the coveted conifers that were the marketable wood for the future, the more it actually shared carbon with these trees. And so, yes, it led me to realize that, that we were looking at forests from such a narrow point of view, that they're made of trees that compete with each other, that actually these trees and plants are in a sophisticated relationship with each other, that they communicate in very sophisticated ways. Yes, they compete with each other, but they also collaborate, and it works to their advantage. It actually provides them with fitness, right? They actually are fitter when they grow in biodiverse communities than when they grow alone, as which we were trying to force on these forests through forest management. So yeah, there was a lot of backlash to this, because as I said, there's huge industries that were poised and built to get rid of these native plants, so as to promote this crop that was going to provide a lot of money. It was really about money, and to dismantle that infrastructure. Well, that was not an easy task to do, and I still have not done that. But that is why I think when you add up all of the infrastructure that is built around this idea of competition, the development of herbicides, how we plant trees, how we work with the plants around them, how we space them apart, how long we let them grow for. I mean, that all of that machinery is put in place in support of this idea that trees really just compete with each other. But in fact, that's not the case. They have very sophisticated ways of communication and interacting that includes collaboration as well.
And we're going to get into how that is true in farming systems too when we talk to David and Anne.
Yes.
Suzanne, you come from a family of forest loggers, as I mentioned, who selectively logged the forest and who at least had some sense of overall forest health. Today, devastating forestry practices clear-cut large swaths of forest using huge equipment weighing as much as 60,000 pounds, are brutally efficient in felling and processing trees. Viewing videos of those feller lumper machines in action, I felt like I was witnessing acts of violence. What is the effect of clear cuts on the mycelium networks, on the regeneration of the forest, and on surrounding ecosystems?
Yeah, this is something that we're looking at more and more carefully. Traditional forestry practices, which started out with horse logging and hand falling, and so the impact was quite small and slow on the forest. So when I grew up in a family of horse loggers, I saw the forest as a regenerative place, and that forestry was a regenerative practice that, that when my great grandfather and grandfather and dad would, take out individual trees, that the forest went through a succession, like it regenerated very easily. You couldn't, the forest was a very healthy and vibrant place. But when I became a forester, I realized that wasn't how forestry was done in the 1970s and the 80s. It really just became this industrial, money-making business. Of course, my family was trying to make a livelihood, and they, of course, had to earn a living doing that. But it wasn't, this, corporate endeavor to make as much money as possible by exploiting forests. But that's what I became, in the industry. I started to see that. And so it moved from, hand falling to more mechanized falling, the use of feller bunchers, and now they use things called hoe checkers, which actually can move up steep slopes and get to places where even 20 years they couldn't get to. Some of these hoe checkers even operate at night without people in them. They're robots, and they go in and harvest trees. And so let me just give you an idea of the impact of this. And I've done a lot of research on this, especially in this project called the Mother Tree Project. And what we've found is this huge loss of forest floor from our soil. So the forest floor is extremely important because this is where most of the nutrients are contained, and this is where most of the soil biology occurs. And what we mean by the forest floor, or the topsoil, is just that organic layer that's on the surface of the mineral soil. Or in very productive forests or an agriculture system, that organic material is actually mixed in with the mineral soil at the surface, and it looks very black or very dark. It's full of organic material and full of life, full of a whole soil food web of organisms that are working together. And so what we found in the Mother Tree Project, and verified through so many observations in looking at these logging practices, is that we're losing in our interior forest. So that would be your east side forest if you're in Oregon or California or Washington, that these mechanized harvesting systems are causing the loss of about 60% of the carbon from the forest floor. And this is a big difference from earlier analyses of loss of forest floor from forestry practices that were analyzed even a decade ago. And I think it's largely because our mechanization and the machinery has changed. But back then, using rubber tired skidders and so on, we were only losing about 30%. So now we're losing even more. And I'm just going to add one more little anecdote. I was on a field trip on the coast, in the coast regions with the Kwakwaka'wakw people, which is a nation on the eastern side of Vancouver Island, and going into old growth forests, and next door into forests that have been logged, hand-felled 130 years ago, and then going next door, even like 100 meters away, into a forest that had been logged a second time. So the old growth forests have been logged, the second growth logged again, and then the third growth was growing. And just to give you an idea of how much loss this carbon capital is, we were in these old growth forests, there is like a meter of forest floor. Right next door in the 130-year-old soil, it was only 50 centimeters. So we'd lost, even from that old conventional harvesting, half of the forest floor. In the third growth stand, it was down to 4 centimeters. This is an enormous loss. And, just to put it in context at a national scale, Canada actually contains, this is a new study that just came out, 25% of the world's soil carbon. And this is an enormous loss and an enormous responsibility that we carry for looking after these forests in a better way than what's going on right now.
This whole industrialization of living systems, your work is really exposing the problems, the deep problems with that. In fact, the language that you use sometimes, like mother trees, wisdom of the forest, communication among trees, has connotations that lean more towards traditional indigenous knowledge than scientific nomenclature. And you once said that the Coast Salish are more scientific than we are. Mm-hmm. What are you trying to convey with your choice of language, and in what ways are the Coast Salish more scientific?
So, the coastal nations, including the Coast Salish, including the Nachanla, the Kwakwaka'wakw, the Haltzik, the Haida, the Tsimshian, the Tlingit, all the way up and down the coast, have lived here for thousands of years. On Haida Gwaii, the estimate is that the Haida people were there for 14,000 years. Other estimates since glaciation, about 10,000 years. And over these thousands of years living in the land, through the process of science, of trying things, observing, adapting, changing, they developed methodologies, ancient methodologies for stewarding the land, for caring for the land. And it was in, of course, their best interest to look after the land, to respect it, because the land gave back. They felt, or they still, worldview is that we are all connected together, that people are part of the land and the land is part of us. And so this ancient wisdom bore out in a very wealthy societies in North America. Major societies have great wealth and culture and art that developed through working with the land. And I'll give you one example of how this worked with salmon. So along the north coast, where I'm from in British Columbia, the people depend on salmon, and they also depend on cedar, of course. That is the tree of life, and they worked very carefully to maintain these salmon populations. So they use fishing technologies that allowed them to basically to monitor the salmon populations, and that actually allowed them to also care for the large mothers. So let me explain that. They built these ancient tidal stone traps, and which are like walls that are made of stone that are under the tide. And during spawning season, when the tide comes in and then the tide goes out, the salmon get trapped behind these walls. And then they would passively fish for the salmon. But they always knew which ones were the big mother fish, and they let those big mothers migrate upstream and spawn in their natal streams. And so the big mothers, the big old fecund females, laid big eggs, which made big fry, which then created a big healthy salmon population. That salmon was then, their carcasses were carried into the forest by the bears and the wolves, and these salmon were eaten there, and whatever was remaining decayed into the forest floor, which was picked up by the trees. The tree of life, the cedar tree, which was, a very important cultural tree for all of these nations in providing food and shelter, for providing clothing and mats and boxes. It was very much part of their lives. And so that was, they were looking after the trees at the same time that they were looking after the salmon that were basically fertilizing these forests. And then the trees would then grow big and productive, that provided wealth and also shaded the streams for the fry, which would then go back out to the ocean to carry out the rest of their life cycle in the ocean. And in this way, by monitoring the fish, by selecting the big mothers so that they could go upstream to spawn, they actually, we think, enhance the salmon populations. And so they were working together with their resources, right? With monitoring and watching and adjusting. Now, if that's not science, I don't know what is. And now, basically colonization took over that salmon fisheries practices and said, oh, we're going to apply Western science to the harvest. Well, we know what's happened to the salmon population since then. And it's because it's not based on good observation of attunement to what's happening in the salmon runs. So yes, that's why I call it a more sophisticated science. It's based on a lot more knowledge and care, and also this adaptive part where we go back and learn from our mistakes.
And based on the relationship between salmon and the health of the forest. I mean,
Yes, these connections are sacred. The connection between the people, the salmon, the trees, the wolves, the bears, the eagles, the water, the forest, the oceans. It's sacred to maintain those relationships. And once they're broken, then the systems unravel. And our indigenous people knew that. And so we're seeing this great unraveling now, and that's expressed in loss of biodiversity and climate change.
and and the long vision of indigenous people to understand that their time on earth is short, and their descendants will follow them. uh,
Absolutely. They are, they talk about and honor the 7 generations coming ahead of them, that everything you do, you need to make sure, that there's going to be a good life for the next 7 generations. I don't think, that Western science thinks about that. What Western science thinks about, if it thinks at all, is about it, basically using nature, but without giving back for the environment or for the next generations. So that kind of thinking has to be really transformed. We have to go back to that indigenous way of thinking, of giving back, that it's a reciprocal relationship, instead of that just always taking. And I think that we're learning from our indigenous neighbors that this is a very productive way to go.
And you have a long vision for some work that you're doing, a project that you mentioned in your plenary, the Mother Tree Project.
Yeah, so this is a project that it's a large long-term project. I'm working with many of the nations in British Columbia in collaboration, as well as with the big forest companies, as well as with community forests, and with the vision that we want to keep these forests intact, to be connected, to maintain those relationships so that we can continue to have the biodiversity and carbon stocks and good water and clean air that comes from them, by working with the forest, not working against it or taking it, but actually leaving these old mother trees behind, because we know, based on our research and based on also thousands of years of knowledge, that these old trees actually nurture the forest. And we've done, very careful work using stable isotope probing to look at how, carbon and water and nutrients move from these mother trees to the next generations. And so we've designed this project on how do you harvest or how do you care for a forest while keeping it intact and also promoting its regeneration. And also, what we found is that keeping these old trees there and protecting them with neighbors, with their kin, because they can recognize their kin by protecting them with their other species that aren't the same, keeping their neighbors that are the animals and fungi and all the soil microbiome intact, that these forests will keep their carbon in the ground. They store carbon, they sequester carbon, they have high levels of biodiversity. And really, I have to say that this methodology, it's really selective cutting, taking out a few trees here and there, has been practiced for a long time by the Menominee Nation in Wisconsin, where they've actually found that they've increased the productivity of the forest through their selective harvesting. There are examples around the world where this works beautifully. And so that's what we're working on, is how do you do that in some of these other forests where it hasn't been done before, where it's really just the standard practice is clear cut, take everything and walk away after you plant it and hope that it comes back. But we're finding that there's much better ways to keep these forests intact.
And another aspect is that you're helping species move in so that they can adapt to climate change. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the velocity of climate change, people are studying how fast climate change is happening, and of course, it's not linear; it's non-linear, it's episodic. It can be very destructive, and plants and trees. We've been studying them for a long time too. We know rates of adaptation. We know how quickly they can migrate, and it's an order of magnitude or more or less than the velocity of climate change. So there's no way that trees and plants are going to be able to migrate as quickly or adapt as quickly as they need to in order to survive in their local environments. And so there's this methodology that is called assisted migration, where people can actually move genotypes or species into different areas so that there can be, sort of from warmer climates to colder climates that are warming up, so that they're pre-adapted already to these warming conditions. And one of the things that we found in migrating species within the Mother Tree Project and migrating genotypes of Douglas fir is that you can migrate, you can move seed quite far within a certain relative distance of within certain numbers of kilometers and 100 and like 100 or 200 meters elevation, and those seeds, those locally adapted seeds, will do just as well or almost as well in this new environment. But what we've found is that the migration of genotypes is enhanced by much more, by 20 to 30% survival rate, if you migrate them into forests that have the legacy trees left behind. So these mother trees that will, basically, accept these new migrants into them, embrace them into their mycorrhizal network and start nourishing them through the delivery of carbon and nutrients and water until these migrants get a head start and then can make it on their own. So yeah, we found that it makes a major difference when these new migrants come into a healthy forest that's intact, that has got its legacies in place, the soil microbiome is healthy, and then we can be successful at doing this. But moving them into big, vacant lots is not going to work, right? We've got to actually have healthy environments to move them into.
That's a whole new concept for me, thinking of trees as migrants, but
Yeah.
absolutely necessary. Amazing work, Suzanne. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. But during the Dust Bowl, President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "A nation that destroys its soil destroys itself." David Montgomery, through the lens of geomorphology, study of landforms and how they influence ecosystems and human societies, found FDR's words to be historically accurate when he did the research for his book, Dirt, The Erosion of Civilizations. While studying these epic realities, David watched his wife, biologist Anne Biklé, toiling away in their Seattle home garden, trying to remedy their own poor soil. Anne's ultimate success in building carbon in the soil was a genesis for their co-authorship of The Hidden Half of Nature. David followed that with Growing Revolution, showcasing regenerative farmers whose practices optimize the life and health of the soil. Anne and David's latest collaboration is connecting the dots among soil health, nutrient density of plants, and human health. Their new book, What Your Food Ate, will be released in 2022. First question is for you, David. Your work has deepened the understanding that microorganisms created the self-renewing fertility cycles that resulted in the deep, rich topsoil of the prairies and the forests that Suzanne was just talking about. How do modern agricultural practices disrupt those fertility cycles?
It was wonderful to hear Suzanne talk about her work again, because the parallels with what she's discovered and has worked on in the world of forestry with what we've poked our noses into in the world of agriculture are profound and run right through to the bottom line, being that symbioses, the cooperation between microbial life and larger life forms, really seems to be a major organizing principle behind how nature works. And looking into the role of soil degradation and soil loss in how it has affected human societies in the past, really structured what I wrote about in Dirt. And as you mentioned, watching Anne restore the soil in our yard while I was writing about the history of land degradation around the world since the last ice age was a real eye opener to see how fast soil could be rebuilt and restored, and how fundamentally that depended on restoring the life in the soil. All those kinds of connections that Suzanne was talking about between the fungal networks in soil communities and the bacterial communities that develop as well. And what modern agriculture has done is really disrupted those symbioses, so broken many of those connections in different ways. It's not exactly the same thing as what Suzanne was talking about, but the parallels are so profound that we need to basically rethink how we think about the soil, whether it's in forest systems or whether it's in agricultural systems or our own yard, and think about it as the biological foundation for the health of what's above ground as well. And that's essentially why Anne and I called our book "The Hidden Half of Nature." Is the world out of sight and out of mind beneath our feet in the soil has really not received the attention and respect that it really deserves as the foundation for terrestrial life. And so how does modern farming disrupt those connections and symbioses? Well, there's really a couple ways. And the one that was most surprising to me in researching Dirt was to really discover or teach myself that the plow had been a very destructive implement. And when you think about a plow through the lens of the mycelial networks that Suzanne was talking about, what does it do? It disrupts them. It breaks them up. It severs the connections between the plants that are being connected and between the fungi and their botanical hosts. And those connections are every bit, it turns out, as adapted and mutually beneficial to the fungi and to crops as they are in forested systems, and as beneficial as they are as the relationships between plants and pollinators that we sort of can see with our own senses and study with traditional in the modern scientific sense of ways of exploration. But new tools open the doors in the last few decades to understanding the microbial connections that have shed light on what's really behind some of the ancient wisdom that Suzanne was talking about. So modern agriculture, through disrupting those types of symbioses and degrading soil organic matter and the loss of soil carbon, which as a global average on agricultural fields, that loss of about half of what's stored in soils that Suzanne was mentioning for forests, that number is a pretty good one for an estimate for agricultural fields around the world as well. And that represents a huge loss of carbon storage in a system that carbon could actually be put to real use, benefiting humanity and benefiting natural ecosystems through enhancing its productivity. So a lot of the world's agricultural land has been degraded in terms of its fertility through really parallel processes to what's been happening in forested systems. And I think we could stand to learn an awful lot by recognizing the parallels between those systems and the lessons for what it means for how nature actually works.
You have a mantra about what direction and what practices regenerative agriculture should go. Do you want to talk about those three principles that that flip the way that farming is done?
Yeah, sure. Those three principles. I'll mention the mantra in a moment, but they came from recognizing that when we visited farms around the world that had restored fertility to their land very rapidly, that were really regenerative farms in terms of soil health, they adopted practices that followed principles that were actually pretty parallel to what Anne had done in our yard. And she and I boiled that down to ditch the plow, cover up, and grow diversity, minimize disturbance of the soil through getting away from tillage, the physical disruption that breaks those mycelial networks, by using cover crops to planting communities of crops, either in crop rotations or in between crops in terms of growing a polyculture, and to grow a diversity of crops. Again, either in a rotation or at one time. And those three principles of ditch the plow, cover up, and grow diversity are the things that you would do in agriculture if your overarching goal was to cultivate the beneficial life in the soil, to cultivate the bacterial communities and fungal communities that form those symbiotic relationships and partnerships with crops, and then enhance the fertility of land, and that what many traditional farming practices around the world had actually helped with. But the combination of the minimal disturbance, the cover crops, and growing a diversity, which results in a diversity of exudates or a diversity of compounds that plants exude into the soil to feed microbial networks that then do things in return for them, that combination is really, we like to characterize it as a merging of ancient wisdom, the ancient wisdom of cover crops and crop rotations, because those are not new ideas. They have long histories and traditions in many parts of the world. But doing it with minimal disturbance and doing it on large acreages is a new opportunity for marrying modern science with traditional wisdom. And so that's where we see as sort of a real avenue for agriculture to grow and develop in what we've termed the fifth agricultural revolution, one premised on building and maintaining and supporting soil health, putting the health and fertility of the land first in terms of our farming practices. It pays off in many of the ways that parallel what Suzanne was talking about in terms of enhancing the productivity of our fields, building the soil organic matter content, building soil nitrogen, building soil carbon in ways that also enhance nutrient cycling that, as Anna and my new book looks into, can actually pay benefits in terms of human health through the nutritional quality of our food.
My next question is for you, Anne. And David just touched on the relationship between microorganisms and plants themselves. And I know this is an area that you get very excited about, the rhizosphere, an area of important biological activity. What is the rhizosphere? And tell us what's happening down there. Are you with us, Anne?
Yeah, I am. Thanks for that. Thanks for that question, Artie. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay. Okay. The rhizosphere. This is really the heart of the plant microbiome. And the rhizosphere is the place in the soil. If you picture a plant's root system, and then the rhizosphere is this narrow zone, somewhat like a halo, that goes around each and every root and root hair of the root system. And it's in the rhizosphere, all these things that Suzanne was talking about, the communication that's flowing between the mother trees and the other trees in the forest, and what Dave just went over as far as ditching the plow and using cover crops. The rhizosphere is a place where all of this communication between plants and the soil microbiome takes place. And one of the reasons, well, the chief reason for that is that uh, we've got plants that are pushing exudates out of their root system. And you've got these microbial communities that are hungry and they need nutrients. And so they're flocking to the rhizosphere to take in what all of these plants are have been manufacturing in their green body, all of these exudates. And some people often say, oh, exudates, they're just sugars, they're just carbohydrates. But that's not quite the whole story on what the soil microbiome is consuming there in the rhizosphere. There's there are carbs, but there's fats and there's proteins and there's other compounds that probably we don't actually completely understand what they all are. So the rhizosphere is the heart of this exchange, this grand exchange that takes place in the soil. And this also makes it, I think, sort of the this is a place of intelligence, of nature's intelligence there in the rhizosphere. And when I say intelligence, I mean that, in every sense of the word. That's where the plants are stuck in place, right? They can't go off journeying and exploring and experimenting with what they run into. And so they rely on the soil microbiome, fungi in particular, to bring information and intelligence about who else is out there. What are they doing? Is it a friend? Is it a foe? And and so this is how plants sort of protect and take care of themselves and also take care of their kin plants. It's really one of the grandest partnerships that takes place in the rhizosphere, Artie, that we know about in the history of life. So that's and I am a little wild about the rhizosphere. Um, if anyone is having trouble imagining this or what does that look like, they can go back to my keynote talk, and there's a slide in there that's called the Biological Bazaar. It's this grand meeting place for exchanges.
So David talked about farming practices that support the microbial life and support these interactions between plants and microbes. I think for most people, it's fairly easy to understand how pesticides and fungicides can destroy life in the soil, but maybe a little harder to understand the effect of chemical synthetic fertilizers on soil health. What impact do synthetic fertilizers have on microorganisms and their relationship to plants?
Yeah. Um, I'll put it this way. I'll start out with it's a complex relationship, and there is a lot of variability. And this is what, a lot of agronomic research is about. What happens with our crops when we fertilize them and when we don't fertilize them with this form of nitrogen or that form of nitrogen? And the basic kind of the bottom line on all of this, Artie, and I want to say, this is a general statement, depends on what crop, what kind of soil, what kind of cultivar of what crop, but everything that I was talking about that takes place in the rhizosphere and what Suzanne was talking about as well. Imagine dropping, a bomb's worth of a nutrient that plants must have, which is nitrogen. That's what fuels their growth. So you drop bomb loads of nitrogen into the soil, and you better believe that plants and fungi and microbes and all forms of soil life are going to turn and go, wow, look at all of that. It's kind of like, I would liken it to sort of the same way, there's a major change to the tax code. And all of a sudden you get a lot of behavior change, don't you? You get different motivations and different incentives and so on and so forth. And so in the soil, when you drop a bunch of a nutrient in there, mostly what it does is it scuttles this communication that's happening in the rhizosphere. And so, plants are not stupid, microbes are not stupid. And a plant looks up and says, wow, look, all that free stuff up there, I'm going to shut or at least reduce my exudate production down, because I would rather use all of this energy from photosynthesis and grow myself, some big fat leaves and a bigger stalk and so on and so forth. So the plant takes a look at nitrogen as a thing that it needs, a thing that it wants. And if it doesn't have to put any energy out to get it, that's what the plant body will do. And microbes, unfortunately, what that means is that there's been a lot of experiments and research that look at root growth and nitrogen fertilizers, and pretty much across the board, but not in all cases. What you find is root growth is less. So you get these kind of paltry, puny root systems relative to an environment that doesn't have much nitrogen, that is. And so what do you think a paltry, puny root system is pushing out in terms of exudates? What do you think that communication and that intelligence is like? I'll just sort of say it. It's less than. It's less than normal. It's less than what it should be. It's less than really what you want for the long-term health of plants, and especially a really long-lived plant like a tree. If you're talking in an annual crop, that's a little bit different. So this sort of diminished root system, it's not pushing out exudates. And so the soil microbiome is malnourished. They're not getting quite enough to eat. And when, say, fungi aren't getting enough of these photosynthetically produced exudates, why would they fetch as much as they were before for the plant? And why would bacteria be able to pull in these exudates and churn out metabolites? Everything sort of slows down. And this is a real problem, Artie, mostly because the soil microbiome and everything that's going on in the rhizosphere, this is the botanical world's grand strategy for health and well-being. So here we are chiseling away at it with nitrogen fertilizers. And we can, farmers and gardeners and foresters, you can compensate for some of that biology, but it costs money and it has impacts, and it generally doesn't work nearly as well as letting a plant work on and work out and develop, these partnerships and these relationships that they have had with the soil microbiome for, a little over 400 million years. And when I think about that kind of a track record and that kind of success, I ask myself, why would I mess with that? Why would I not use that? And although we don't understand everything about soil microbiota, and we probably never will, the way I think about it is, if that process is functioning normally and nutrients are flowing like they should, I don't need to know the details, because I know at a higher level that things are working, and they're working well for the plant, for the environment, and that if you're growing food to eat, that's going to tend on the whole to be putting things like phytochemicals and fats and minerals. These are three areas that Dave and I deeply researched for what your food ate. We know that those things are normal. So that's it on nitrogen fertilizer. The real problem, Marty, it's just like we human beings, we think if a little bit is good, more is better. So what do? We get jugs and boxes and everything, and we just dump it into the soil and back off, step away from the stuff. And a little bit is not harmful. A little bit can be helpful in certain situations, certain crops, and certain soils.
I do not think that most farmers realize that when they're fertilizing their crops, they're disrupting a symbiotic relationship that has evolved over eons and eons. So that was really interesting. Thank you so much. You started to talk about the nutrient, um, how plants produce nutrients. Um, a group of scientists from the University of Natural Resources and Life Science, Vienna, in a research paper called Soil Contributes to Human Gut Microbiome, suggests that we consider the human intestinal microbiome as well as the soil root microbiome as superorganisms, which by close contact replenish each other with inoculants, genes, and growth sustaining molecules. How do you see that?
Yeah, that's I've read that paper as well, and it, I don't really like this term superorganism. Um, I think kind of the problem with it is it still sort of somehow implies this this separateness or this apartness from um, from our bodies and the bodies of plants and their microbiomes. And you know, science is a field where we need to talk about things. We need to explain things and describe things and label things and so on and so forth. And so we like new words and we like new terms. But I think in the case, you know, this superorganism thing, it, it it strikes me sort of the same way that the term superfoods strikes me. And I know Dave and I differ a little bit on this, but I this idea that something is super, that we need to eat only superfoods, or that we're like some kind of special superorganism, I don't totally buy that. What I buy is that it's normal, and it's normal to the functioning of plant bodies and human bodies when we're intact and when we're whole. And so instead of this concept of super, I like this concept of wholeness and oneness, and that wholeness and oneness is not the same between any of us, and it's not the same in any you know, any piece of ground or any soil plot either. So that really what we have is this this way of looking at life that sees things as intimately connected, intimately connected with everything we need to be a whole functioning being. And I think part of where we got off on this superorganism idea is that for a long, long time, you know, ever since the Origin of Species came out, and Darwin sat on this idea and on this book for, you know, a couple decades before he put that book out. And it's this idea that evolution and the way in which we and every other organism on this planet came into being is encapsulated in this phrase called nature red in tooth and claw. And if it were we were talking about plants, we might say, you know, nature red in root and leaf. And what that is basically saying is that there's this competition, there's direct competition between different life forms, and whichever life form gets a leg up on the other one, well, that's the one that succeeds, and that's what surrounds us today. And this whole the microbiome, I love how it has just completely blown out of the water that there are evolution is occurring in all kinds of ways, different mechanisms, different pathways, and the grand partnership that's happening between plants and soil microbiota and all of this stuff that Suzanne talked about with her Mother Tree project, that is just as important as the direct conflict stuff. So it all depends on what kind of organism you are, right? You're a little tiny one-celled bacterium. You're not getting a leg up on anybody. Nobody. You're a little tiny thing. But associate and congregate with your brethren microbiota and form a biofilm, and you're talking, you know, that's putting you in business. That's the business of life. So I really like thinking about cooperation and combinations that make beings whole. So we all have strengths and weaknesses, and so do plants. So does every organism on this planet. And yet, if we can find others that can fill in for my weakness, then that's a good thing. So basically, this whole idea of superorganisms, I see it as okay, my microbiome. Wow, what's theirs is mine, and what's mine is theirs. And the only way we're going to survive together is to recognize that and to work together to bring sort of the strengths of both to the picture of life. So that's my take on superorganisms and all of that stuff, Artie.
That's great. And I want to bring Suzanne into this. Suzanne, I read an interview by Sheldon Meldrake, and he said he was talking about the mycelium network in forests, and he said something like, they challenge the notion of individuality. So, and it's okay for scientists to have different perspectives on this. So how do you see this?
I concur with Anne and David. The soil is a consortium of species that work together, and it really is a microbiome where it's not any one single individual or any one single species. It's that these organisms are in these communities, and it is the emergence of the processes out of the interaction or the relationships between these organisms that we get the big cycles, the carbon cycle, the nutrient cycle, the water cycle, and so on. So yeah, it is a community. It's a community effect. It's driven by photosynthesis. Photosynthate is what is the energy that drives the cycles that are basically underpinned by the soil microbiota. And it's a community. It's not any one single. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but yeah.
You did. No, I think the complexity and the elegance of what's going on underground, as much as all of you have studied this and understand it, there's lots more to understand and find out about. I want to bring it back to farming, and this is a question for David. Modern industrial farming is largely, as we've mentioned, a chemical and mechanical process driven by mega corporations who produce patented seeds as well as the pesticides and the fertilizers that those seeds require. What is it going to take to help farmers understand that agriculture is fundamentally a biological process and convince them to change the way that they farm?
Boy, that's a great question, because that's really putting your finger right on kind of the problem with what happened with agriculture in the 20th century. Is that, as odd as it may sound, is we kind of lost sight of the fact that biology and the relationships between organisms, it's at the root of farming. We made great strides in understanding soil chemistry and soil physics and how that affects plant growth, but we really neglected the kind of relationships we've been talking about so far in terms of what became modern conventional agriculture, and with its disruptive effects on soil ecology, soil biology, and the partnerships between plants and soil life. And so what would it take to actually sort of change that? And we can answer that at sort of several different levels. And at the broadest level, I think it's going to take a different philosophy of farming and a different way of thinking about the soil. And by philosophy of farming, I mean the idea of putting soil health first, of thinking about the way that we treat the land in the act of farming, how that affects the health of the land as foundational for everything else that will flow from the land. In terms of how we think about the soil, all too often in the 20th century, we were training people to think about the soil as something to hold plants upright, while we added the elements that we needed to achieve the kind of growth or yield that was desired on a farm. If we think about the soil instead as essentially the living foundation that for nutrient cycling that helps promote fertility, it leads us down different paths in terms of how we think about farming practices. But and we've made the case in our books for the need for a fifth agricultural revolution centered around the idea of building soil health as the new foundation for agriculture. But what would it take to actually translate that into practice? Well, first of all, it means that we're going to have to devise systems of farming for where that actually works. Figure out how to apply practices based on those principles of minimal disturbance, of cover cropping, and of diversity. How to make that work in different parts of the world. The different climates with different soils and different kinds of crops will require different types of practices and adaptations and rotations to actually be successful. And it will also require that those farms be profitable in whatever economic system that they're operating within. Because for a farm to be sustainable, that you need to be able to sustain farming. And so figuring out how to developed systems of farming that would work in that sense is the first order of business there. And that's what actually started turning me into an optimist on the issue of whether we could actually reverse the long-term pattern of soil degradation that has affected farmland around the world, and pull off a real regenerative farming revolution. Because I visited farms where farmers had already done it, where they demonstrated that it could actually work, and that it did so in ways that so reduced their expenditures for fossil fuels, for fertilizers, and for pesticides, let alone patented seeds, that their farms were far more profitable, because after a short transition period, they were as productive as conventional farms that were very dependent on the sort of the modern conventional inputs, fertilizers, diesel, and agrochemicals. And so we have examples now from places around the world in different kinds of farming systems where it has worked to actually regenerate soil fertility and to rebuild the health of the land. And that by worked, I mean, it's worked for the farmer as well as for the land. And the new book that Ann and I have just finished looks at what that might mean for human health in terms of the nutritional quality of our food as well. So we've got some research needs in terms of figuring out really how to adapt farming practices in different areas to these principles. We've got some economic needs in terms of rethinking how we subsidize practices in agriculture. At the moment, we're basically subsidize practices that degrade the land, and it makes more sense over the long run to subsidize those practices that rebuild the health and fertility of the land. So we have our subsidies on backwards. We have a system of farm advising that is really centered around selling inputs, selling things to farmers rather than teaching them practices through which they could actually use fewer of those products. And that problem runs through to the research world as well, where there's far more research support for developing new products than there are for evaluating practices that are designed to wean farmers off of modern agrochemical products.
You've visited some places where, as you mentioned, farmers are having success, and of all places, the Midwest. You want to talk about some of the farmers you visited there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I visited farmers in equatorial Africa, in Central America, and across North America, and some of the most inspiring were farmers in the Midwest. And I could mention three in particular in terms of David Brandt in Carroll, Ohio, who was a farmer who is growing wheat, corn, and soybeans for the North American commodity crop markets, but he's doing it with practices that are based on the principles that I was talking about earlier, where he grows a very diverse mix of cover crops on his farm. And so the crops that he's selling into commodity markets, but he's treating his land very differently in terms of how he farms, and he's more productive and more profitable than his conventional neighbors. And his soil has gone from a couple percent organic matter back to a level of carbon that was about comparable to, if not in excess, of what the native soil had in his semi-forested landscape in Ohio. So he's basically restored fertility to the land, restored it back to sort of native fertility levels, and he did it with this unconventional style of regenerative agriculture. Another farmer I could mention is Gabe Brown, a gentleman who farms in Bismarck, North Dakota, who has sort of taken the kinds of practices that David Brandt was using, but also added to livestock back into the mix in terms of reintegrating animal husbandry onto his land. And he demonstrated very nicely that that suite of regenerative practices and regenerative ranching practices can really rebuild the health and fertility of the land, in the course of a decade or two, which to a geologist like myself is incredibly rapid. And that's his farm is Brown's Ranch. The third farmer I'll mention is Jonathan Lundgren, who runs Blue Dasher Farm. He's a ex-USDA research entomologist who has created an incredibly biodiverse farm in South Dakota that's very productive and is a very unconventional model for the American Midwest. He's not growing crops for the commodity crop markets. He's raising lamb. He's raising sheep and lambs, and has fruit trees. He has an incredibly biodiverse farm. It's a place where when you first walk onto it, you go, well, this is more life than I've seen in terms of diversity of life on a farm in a long time. You then walk over to his neighbors' farms, and there's hardly any life other than corn and soybeans. So there's inspirational examples of farmers all around the world who have adopted these regenerative techniques, who are demonstrating, day by day, year by year, that a different style of farming could actually really work to help feed the world without compromising our ability to feed ourselves. And so one of the big lessons I've taken away from all the research Ann and I have done on this subject is that we don't really face a choice between an environmentally better farming and feeding the world. In fact, if we're going to feed the world over the long run, we have to adopt this style of regenerative farming.
If it can be done in the Midwest, I say it can be done anywhere. So, Suzanne, you talked about this a little bit. We do have some time for some questions from the audience, so please add them to the chat box, and we'll get to as many as possible. One of those questions, Suzanne, was: is the work that you're doing, particularly with the Mother Tree Forest? I'm sorry, the Mother Tree Forest project.
Yeah.
Is anything like that happening elsewhere?
Selective harvesting of trees has been around for a long, long time. It's not, selective harvesting has been practiced in North America since, really since people came here, since they built their towns and cities and population built up. It's been, most of North America has lived in and among forests, and that means selective harvesting. It means also growing food crops. Like these practices go back millennia. I know that along the West Coast, for example, that that they would selectively harvest trees or change the tree species composition, as well as the plant community around the town, the little villages, so that they had food and resources available to them that weren't very hard to get. They cultivated trees to become, trees for buildings, for longhouses, for bark, for cedar, making clothing. And this happens around the world, even in Europe, right? In Europe, when they were developing harvesting techniques in Germany, which is really, where forestry really was honed as a trade, that each family, each village, each watershed had developed their own harvesting techniques, and a lot of it was selective harvesting, leaving some old trees behind that was adapted to that local watershed or that local community or that local family, really. And a lot of what they call the silviculture systems of, what do you take away and what do you leave behind, was really locally adapted to the land. And that's very much similar to, to what I'm describing along in North America. What our Aboriginal people did too is that they developed their techniques according to what worked in their local area. And I think that this is something that drives us to develop new techniques, to, as David was talking about, with agriculture, that we need to develop, place-based agricultural techniques that vary according to that local condition. It's the same thing in forests, and that should involve basically the same principles that Anne and David are talking about, protecting the soil and leaving, plants, native plants, using the native biodiversity, making sure there are cover crops. In forestry, that's trees that, form a cover that photosynthesize and that they provide energy to the soil, which drives, the soil food web, which drives the nutrient cycles. These principles are the same whether you're in a forest or an agricultural system, and they need to be locally adapted, and they need to leave the, as in agriculture, the seed sources, the legacies, the carbon sources, the deep forest floor, the deep organic materials. We need to protect those and build them back up, and it can be done. We know we've got stewardship practices dating back thousands of years that we can draw on and work with and make them place-based practices that really do work and are regenerative.
And don't you give examples of forests? There's a process where the clear cut happens, herbicides are sprayed, and then monocrops are put in. But you say that if you do selective harvesting, then the forest, there's a seed bank in the forest itself that will regenerate.
Yeah, I think that the history of forestry follows the history of agriculture. In fact, forestry drew from agriculture, and all these concepts that we've been talking about, competition, and then the addition of fertilizers and resources to grow forests in a way that's quite manicured and like a farm. That stuff is going on all the time. Clear cutting, spraying herbicides to get rid of the native plants, bringing in seedlings grown in nurseries that really are devoid of the local soil food web, planting them out, again, spraying herbicides if you need to encourage the growth, make sure they're not being competed against, cultivating these tree farms. And these are high energy input systems. Like, these are systems that are not sustainable. And we do need to find better ways. And we know enough that leaving the old, like I said, the intact seed banks, the cones of the trees that provide seeds that have been locally adapted to that area, and then also moving things in order to make sure that we have a healthy community as climate is changing. We have the capacity to do all this stuff, but we need to get off of this track that David so eloquently described of adding things and being enamored with the silver bullet that's going to suddenly make our solve all our problems. It doesn't. It actually makes worse problems as the soil degrades. And I'll just add one more thing that I think wasn't mentioned yet, is that when you add these things to the soil like fertilizer, and you change the plant community and you change the microbiome, you also change soil structure. And soil structure is super important. It's the microbes and the fungi that are the glue that give soil structure. And it's soil structure that holds organic matter. And organic matter is what allows soils to hold water and to provide nutrients. And when you strip that away by adding these inputs, by adding fertilizers and even irrigation, that the plants don't actually exude these glues into the soil. They don't support the mycorrhiza. They don't support the food web because they're being given all of that stuff. We actually degrade the soil in so many ways. And that's what leads to soil loss and erosion, because we've lost the capacity for the soil to glue itself together. And that is so important. Like, once you've lost that, you do really have to rebuild it up from scratch. And we don't have to, right? We know enough that we don't have to do this. We need to go back to these more regenerative tools that have been around for thousands of years.
Absolutely. We have a question from Bob Rodriguez. And he says, we know that healthy soil provides healthy plants and helps create healthy people. This goes to Anne and David's new book. But have there not been studies showing communities that eating healthy plants lowers health costs and impacts?
One of the things we had to do in researching the new book is to try and identify all the dots that would connect soil health to plant health, to livestock health, to human health, because scientists have tended to study each of those connections separately. So we couldn't find a study that basically looked at controlling for the health of the soil and then following that all the way through to the composition of crops, to the health of people, to health outcomes in people. But we were able to find examples that connected each set of those dots along the way, but from different studies. So a lot of writing the book actually took us a couple years longer than we had anticipated that it would do. And part of that was due to really having to do a deep dive into each of those connections to try and say, well, how well can you connect all those sets of dots? And we're pretty happy with the result in terms of being able to connect all of them. But there's some pretty big holes in the research world in terms of looking at systems level controlled tests on actually addressing the question of how much does the difference in soil health and soil quality translate through to the end in terms of the nutritional quality of food or human health. Most of the studies that have looked at trying to connect that really frame things around versus conventional versus organic farming, without really looking at the health of the soil and without really looking at how the specific practices in those conventional or organic systems really relate to soil health. So we go all into the history and background of those kind of studies and synopses, and we read all the ones that we could find in researching the book. But it's harder to connect that whole causal chain of logic than you might think in terms of just looking at the scientific literature. But if you dig into it, you can connect each step along the way. And so I think Anne came up with the analogy of we were thinking about it like connecting the beads on a string to actually get from the one point to the other. And I'll let you follow up on that if you want. But it took a lot of we've read a lot of studies to try and
Yeah.
make those connections.
Yeah, the only thing I think I'd add to that is that it would be really great if agronomists would talk more with nutritionists, and if nutritionists would talk more with immunologists, and because the literature is
Good
so.
afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the last day of
Let's see. So yeah, just if agronomy, the fields of agronomy, nutrition, and immunology could somehow come together better so that we would understand better and be able to implement. Oh, you mean we need certain kinds of fats in the human diet in order for our immune system to work normally and to turn inflammation on, but also to turn it off? Oh, well, why? Geez, why didn't immunology crowd? Why didn't you tell us agronomists about this? Because then we could be feeding our animals a different kind of diet. So, in essence, Artie, we've got evidence for a lot of pathways and mechanisms that form the connections between all of these beads, like Dave talked about. Yeah.
Toby Herzlich has a question, and hi, Toby. This is for Anne, I think. She wants to know, is there ways for gardeners to measure carbon in their soil? And I'll just add, did you do that when were you actually measuring carbon in your soil?
Yeah, I like numbers. There's nothing wrong with numbers. What I like better, though, is seeing how the practices that I adopted and implemented in our garden. I mean, all I need to do is like look at the plants. I'm like, oh my God, this plant is happier than a clam, than a whatever. So it's interesting that they asked this question, because it was only after like about, I think, 15 years, maybe 10 years, something like that, that we had a soil scientist pal of ours, Sally Brown, come over, and we said, hey, Sally, you know what? We never actually measured the carbon here in these different beds. And so Sally collected samples and we measured the carbon. And what we found, not surprisingly, was that the veg beds where I had been, that's the creme de la creme of my organic matter operation. The worm bin compost always went to the veg bed. And then I was, playing around with some biochar and some other things like that. And surprise, surprise, the carbon level in the veg bed was, I think it was somewhere around 12 or 13%, something like that. And then what was really interesting, there's all this, people always are trashing lawns, and we have a lawn, but I think about it a little bit differently. It's a mix of species. There's some grass in there. There's some herbs in there. There's a nitrogen fixer in there. And the lawn, beneath the lawn, the soil there had the second highest level of carbon, which I think was like at 8 or 9%. And where we started with, Artie, was we got soil from like the back of the garage, and that was at around, I think, 1 or 2%. So it didn't take long through the addition of organic matter and through just practices. And in the lawn, there's some perennially growing plants in there, the clovers, and we live in the Pacific Northwest. So, growth is really high in spring, summer, and fall, not quite so much in the winter, but those plants are pushing exudates down, carbon, partly into the soil. And so carbon's getting down in there, and that's what we were able to measure. So the way you actually would measure that, gardeners out there, if you're interested, or farmers, is you get a soil sample and you can send it off to a lab, and you can ask, hey, tell me how much carbon is in my soil. And if you're interested in that, then that's kind of the mechanics of how you would do it. But I think one of the chapter headings that we put in the new book, it goes something along these lines. Our one sort of true purpose in life should be to pay attention. And when I'm out in the garden, I mean, that's what I'm doing. I'm paying attention and I'm observing, and that's how I'm noticing. I don't know exactly what's going on between the plant and this soil, but it's good, and I want this to keep going. So I'm not going to change things up. So, so that's the answer to that, I think.
We've only got about a minute left, but we're on the topic of carbon. Anne talked about how it's important for soil structure. Can we talk a little bit about some of the other functions of carbon in soil?
Well, it's essentially the currency that drives nutrient cycling. It's the energy source that helps keep the system moving. And as Suzanne was saying, it's central to soil structure. It's central to water retention, and one that's not as well recognized is it's actually a source of micronutrients. That organic matter, as it decays, microbial action can help liberate some of the elements other than the big major elements. It can liberate mineral micronutrients that have been concentrated in plant matter tissues at levels that are useful for the next generation of life to take up. That might be harder to get out of rocks. So they're you can think of it as a reservoir of fertility, quite literally.
Yeah. And I would just add to that, Artie, I think all of this in this world of climate change, and we've got too much up there and we have enough below our feet. One of the things I don't want us all to get trapped into, and I see it already, is thinking that soil is some kind of lockbox. Like we're going to stuff carbon down there and we're going to lock it up. And that's what we need to do. There's just too much up there. We're going to get it out. And we're going to lock it up down there beneath our feet. And carbon needs to flow and it needs to move. And we need carbon not locked up. We need carbon in life, in these living organisms, because if it's in a life form, it's not up there. And a lot of that life is beneath our feet and it's doing all kinds of things for us. So I'd like to get away from this sort of lock it up in a vault and get the concept more like we need it in circulation, but circulation on the ground and in the ground.
No, thank you for that. I think there is a misunderstanding that carbon, that's a carbon cycle, and it's a healthy carbon cycle that we're looking for. Well, I just want to thank you all. This has been so interesting, so informative, and I am inspired by all the good science that you are all producing. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to talk with y'all.
Thank you.
Yeah, great to be part of the Bioneers community, Artie. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, David. Thank you, Anne.
Okay.